He stood at the entrance of the Grand Convocation Hall, a structure so vast that clouds formed near its ceiling, and he tried very hard not to let his mandibles tremble with awe. The hall floated in orbit above the ancient homeworld of the Thyervan Empress, and it was built from living crystal that sang when you touched it. Every surface reflected light in ways that made the air itself shimmer like water. Korath was young for a Dravari diplomat. He was tall even by the standards of his insectoid species, with 4 blade arms folded respectfully behind his back, and compound eyes that caught every detail in the room. His senior diplomat, Ambassador Thyla, walked beside him with the calm patience of someone who had done this many times before. "Stand straight," Thyla said without looking at him, "and stop clicking your mandibles. You sound like a hatchling." Korath forced himself to stop. He looked out across the hall and tried to take it all in. The Thyervan Empress happened once every 5 galactic years. It was the single most important diplomatic event in the known galaxy. 42 recognized species sent their finest delegations to stand before the Empress, to make their voices heard, to forge alliances, and to settle disputes that might otherwise become wars. And every single one of them came armed. This was tradition, sacred tradition. To carry a weapon into the presence of the Empress was not a threat. It was a declaration. It said, "We are sovereign, we are strong, we have earned the right to stand here." The bigger the weapon, the louder the declaration. Every species understood this. Every species respected it. The Rithkari delegation entered first. They were tall and lean, covered in silver scales that caught the light like mirrors. Each one carried a plasma lance, nearly twice their own height. The lances hummed with a deep vibration that Korath could feel in his chest, even from across the hall. Marched in perfect formation, their lances raised high, and the crowd murmured with approval. Next came the Gorvathi. They were massive creatures, each one a mountain of muscle and bone. They did not carry weapons because they wore them. Their living bone armor was fused directly to their spines and ribs, growing outward into jagged plates and curved horns that could pierce starship hulls. The oldest Gorvathi warrior had armor so thick and layered that he looked less like a person and more like a walking fortress. The Ilvathi floated in on anti-gravity platforms, surrounded by clouds of combat drones that buzzed and clicked like angry insects. Each drone was a tiny killing machine, armed with micro-lasers and needle-thin projectiles. The Ilvathi themselves were soft-bodied and fragile, but their drone swarms made them one of the most feared forces in the galaxy. Species after species entered the hall. The Venari with their sonic disruptors, the Kelesh with their neural whips coiled around their wrists, the Tharn, who were so large that each one carried a cannon meant for mounting on vehicles. Korath watched them all with wide eyes and felt a swell of pride when his own Dravari delegation marched forward, blade arms extended and gleaming under the crystal light. "Is it always like this?" Korath whispered to Thyla. "Every time," she replied, "and every time it is a little different. Watch now." Korath watched. The next delegation was approaching the great doors, and he could see them in the corridor beyond. They were the humans. Korath had read about humans in his preparation files. They were a relatively young species on the galactic stage, having made contact with the wider galaxy only about 200 years ago. They were soft-bodied, with no natural armor, no claws, no venom, no blade arms. They were not particularly fast or strong by galactic standards. They had no special sensory abilities. Planet with a single moon. Nothing remarkable. The reception hall was smaller than the Grand Convocation, but no less impressive. Living crystal walls pulsed with soft light that shifted between blue and gold, and long tables floated at different heights to accommodate the wildly different body shapes of 42 species. Tiny Ilvathi hovered near the ceiling, while enormous Gorvathi stood in specially reinforced alcoves along the walls. Korath moved through the crowd with a plate of nutrient paste that he was too distracted to eat. He kept looking across the room at the human delegation. They stood in a loose cluster near one of the windows, holding glasses of some dark liquid and talking quietly among themselves. They smiled and laughed like people without a single worry in the galaxy. It made no sense. He had spent the last 3 hours watching every other delegation react to the humans, and none of the reactions made sense. The Rithkari, who openly mocked any species they considered weak, gave the humans a wide berth. Respectful distance. The Ilvathi, who were famous for their cutting diplomatic insults, treated the human ambassador with exaggerated courtesy. Even the enormous Tharn, who feared absolutely nothing, seemed to choose their words carefully when a human was nearby. Korath needed answers. He found them in the form of Dren Kalos. Dren was a Gorvathi war historian, old and scarred and enormous, even by Gorvathi standards. His bone armor had been cracked and regrown so many times that it looked like a map of ancient rivers. He sat alone at a reinforced table, drinking something thick and black from a bowl the size of Korath's head. "You are staring at the humans," Dren said without looking up as Korath approached. "Is it that obvious?" "Every first-timer stares at the humans." Dren gestured to the seat across from him with one massive armored hand. "Sit. I will save you the trouble of asking stupid questions by telling you a story." Blade arms folded nervously behind him. "How much do you know about the Sheldari incident?" Dren asked. "Very little. The name is in some of our historical records, but the details are restricted." "Of course they are." Dren took a long drink from his bowl. "Nobody likes to talk about it, because talking about it means admitting what happened. And what happened was embarrassing for everyone except the humans." He set the bowl down and fixed Korath with his small, deep-set eyes. 40 galactic years ago, the Sheldari Dominion was one of the great powers. Big reptilian species, very proud, very aggressive. They had one of the largest fleets in the galaxy, and they made sure everyone knew it. When they came to the Assembly, they carried so many weapons that they needed cargo shuttles just for their ceremonial arms. Korath nodded. He had heard of the Sheldari. They were still around, but greatly diminished. He had never learned why. The humans had only been attending the assembly for about 60 years at that point, and every single time they came with empty hands. Just like tonight, same dark clothes, same calm faces, same nothing. And for 60 years, nobody said a word about it, because most species had already learned to leave the humans alone. "Why?" Korath asked. "What had they learned?" "Patience." Dren said the word like it tasted bad. The humans had fought a few small border conflicts in their early years on the galactic stage. Nothing major. But the species that fought them came away very quiet afterward. They did not boast about their victories because there were no victories to boast about. And they did not complain about their losses because complaining would mean describing what the humans had done to them, and nobody wanted to describe that. Korath felt his mandibles click. But the Sheldari were proud, and they were stupid, which is a dangerous combination, Dren continued. Their warlord at the time, a massive creature called Threx Dominar, decided that the humans coming unarmed was a personal insult to the Empress, and to every armed species in the hall. He stood up in the middle of the assembly and challenged the humans directly. He demanded they either arm themselves or leave. What happened? The human ambassador happened. Her name was Elena Vasquez. She was a small woman, even by human standards. She barely came up to Threx's knee, but she stood and she looked up at this enormous reptilian warlord with all his weapons and all his armor and all his fury, and she smiled. Dren paused, and Korath realized the old Gorvati was not just telling a story. He was remembering. He had been there. Vasquez said something that I have never forgotten. She said, "We did not bring weapons into this hall because we did not think we would need them here. If you would like us to go get some, we can. But I promise you, you will not enjoy what happens after that. And then Threx laughed. He laughed so hard that his bone armor rattled. And then he sent a kill squad to raid a small human colony on the border. A farming world with maybe 30,000 people. He expected the humans to panic and submit and beg for mercy the way so many smaller species had when the Sheldari flexed their muscles. Dren's voice dropped lower. Within 1 galactic week, the humans had identified every supply line that fed the Sheldari military. Every fuel depot, every ammunition factory, every communication relay, every shipyard. They did not announce what they were doing. They did not send threats or ultimatums. They just started. Started what? Taking it apart. Dren's armored hands tightened around his bowl. Not destroying, not burning, not the big dramatic explosions that most species use when they go to war. The humans did not want to make a statement. They wanted to make a point. They dismantled the Sheldari war machine, piece by piece, with a patience and precision that made even the Sheldari commanders sweat. Precision that terrified every intelligence agency in the galaxy. Fuel depots went dark. Supply ships vanished without distress signals. Communication relays simply stopped working one day, and when the Sheldari sent engineers to fix them, they found the relays had been physically disassembled, every component carefully separated and left in neat piles, as if someone had taken apart a child's toy. Within 3 galactic weeks, the Sheldari Dominion had the largest collection of weapons in their region of space, and absolutely no way to use any of them. No fuel, no ammunition, no communications, no supply chain. The humans had not killed their fleet. They had made their fleet meaningless. Korath sat in silence for a long moment. And the colony? He asked quietly. The farming world? The kill squad never arrived. The humans intercepted them 2 systems out. No one knows exactly what happened, but the Sheldari soldiers were returned alive 3 days later in escape pods, stripped of every weapon and every piece of armor, wearing nothing but basic survival suits. Each one had a small data chip pinned to their chest that contained a single message. What did it say? It said, "We could have kept them." Korath's blade arms went rigid. "The Sheldari Dominion still exists," Dren said. "They still attend the assembly, and if you look tonight, you will see that they carry the biggest weapons of anyone in the room. Bigger than the Rithkari, bigger even than us Gorvathi. They carry enough firepower to level a small moon." And the humans? The humans noticed. Dren took another drink. The humans have never once commented on it. He set his bowl down and looked at Korath with an expression that was almost gentle. "Every species in that hall carries weapons to show the Empress what they can do, young Dravari. The humans leave theirs behind to show us what they choose not to do." He leaned forward. "That is the difference. And that is why the room goes quiet when they walk in. Not because they are weak, not because they are foolish. The room goes quiet because every single person in that hall knows that the most dangerous beings in the galaxy just walked in wearing nothing but formal clothes and a polite smile. And every single person in that hall knows that if the humans ever decide to stop smiling, no amount of weapons will save anyone." Korath looked across the reception hall at the human delegation. The tall, dark-skinned man, the one who had nodded at him earlier, was laughing at something one of his colleagues had said. He held his glass lightly, and his hands were relaxed and empty. The closed diplomatic session began on the 3rd day of the assembly, and Korath could feel the tension before he even entered the room. The session chamber was smaller than the grand convocation hall, built in a circular shape with tiered seating that descended toward a central floor of polished white crystal. The Empress sat above it all on a throne of living crystal that grew and shifted with her moods. Today the crystal was dark, almost black, and its edges were sharp. That was never a good sign. Korath took his seat beside Ambassador Thyla and watched the delegations file in. The Rithkari sat rigid with their plasma lances across their laps, The Ilvathi hovered in a tight formation with their drone swarms pulled close. The Gorvathi took up an entire section, and the floor groaned under their weight. The humans sat in their usual section, calm, dark formal clothes, empty hands. Today's session concerned a border dispute between the Ilvathi Consortium and the Darva. Rithkari Pact 3 contestant star systems sat in the overlap between their territories, rich in rare minerals that both species needed for their technologies. Negotiations had been ongoing for nearly 10 galactic years and had gone nowhere. Both sides blamed the other. Both sides had been quietly building up military forces near the disputed border. Both sides were running out of patience. The Ilvathi delegation leader, a soft-bodied creature named Prelate Voss, spoke first. Voss floated on an anti-gravity disk, surrounded by a personal cloud of combat drones that clicked and buzzed with obvious agitation. The Rithkari have violated 17 separate territorial agreements, Voss said, their voice amplified and translated by the Hall's systems. They have placed military installations in 2 of the 3 disputed systems. They build warships in orbit around planets that belong to us by ancient right. We demand immediate withdrawal and full recognition of Ilvathi sovereignty over all 3 systems. Up. The Rithkari response came from Commander Syraf, a tall silver-scaled warrior who stood and planted the butt of his plasma lance on the floor so hard that it cracked the crystal. The Ilvathi claim ancient right, but their ancient right is nothing more than old lies, repeated loudly. Syraf's voice was cold with fury. Those systems were uninhabited when we arrived. Our miners, our engineers, our people built everything that exists there. The Ilvathi contributed nothing, and now they want everything. We will not withdraw. We will not surrender what our people built with their own hands. The chamber erupted. Both sides began shouting. Drone swarms expanded outward in threat displays. Plasma lances hummed louder. The other delegations shifted uncomfortably. Some reached for their own weapons, not to join the fight, but out of instinct. Korath watched with growing alarm. This was not diplomacy anymore. This was 2 species talking themselves into a war. Here in the Empress's own hall. He glanced up at the Empress. Her crystal throne had gone darker still, almost pure black, razor-edged. "This is going badly," Korath whispered to Phila. "Wait," she said. A hand was raised in the human section. Ambassador James Okafor stood. He was the tall, dark-skinned man who had nodded at Korath on the first day. Up close, in the harsh light of the session chamber, Korath could see that Okafor was older than he had first guessed. There were deep lines around his eyes, and his hair was more gray than black. But he moved with a quiet certainty that had nothing to do with youth or strength. "The chair recognizes the human delegation," the session moderator announced. Okafor walked down the tiered seating toward the central floor. He moved slowly, not with hesitation, but with the deliberate calm of someone who wanted every eye in the room to see exactly what he was doing. And what he was doing was walking unarmed into the hall. Space between 2 hostile delegations. The Ilvathi drone swarm was to his left, a buzzing cloud of tiny killers, any one of which could put a needle through his skull in a fraction of a second. The Rithkari plasma lances were to his right, humming with enough energy to vaporize him where he stood. Okafor walked between them like a man walking through a garden. He stopped in the exact center of the floor and stood there with his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He looked at the Ilvathi. He looked at the Rithkari. He waited until the shouting faded into silence, because it was impossible to keep shouting when a man with no weapons and no protection was standing calmly in your line of fire. "Prelate Voss," Okafor said. His voice was quiet, but the chamber's acoustics carried it perfectly. "Your claim to ancient territorial right is based on the Voss-Therian survey of galactic year 4012. That survey mapped the 3 systems, but never established permanent habitation. Markers. The legal precedent under the Empress's charter requires continuous habitation or active resource development within 50 years of a survey claim to maintain sovereignty. You are currently 14 years past that deadline. Voss went very still. Their drones stopped buzzing. Commander Cyrath, OK4 continued, turning to the Rythkari. Your military installations in Systems 2 and 3 were constructed during a period when both systems were under a joint development moratorium, agreed to by both the Consortium and the Pact, in Galactic Year 448. Your own High Command signed that agreement. I have the original document with the seal of your predecessor, Commander Vreth Cyrath, who I believe was your broodmother. Cyrath's silver scales flushed dark with what Korath assumed was embarrassment or fury, or both. Now, OK4 said, and his voice shifted. It was still quiet, but there was a weight to it that pressed down on the room like gravity. Legitimate grievances. And both of you have made mistakes. You can continue shouting about those mistakes until one of you fires the first shot, and then you will have a war. A war over 3 star systems that will cost you thousands of ships and millions of lives. And at the end of it, whoever wins will inherit rubble. He paused. Or you can listen to what I'm about to propose. Korath leaned forward. He could not help it. System 1 goes to the Elvathi Consortium, Okafor said. Your ancient survey does establish a valid cultural claim to that specific system, and it contains the mineral deposits most critical to your medical technologies, which your people need to survive. System 3 goes to the Rythkari Pack. Your people built the infrastructure there, and the mineral composition of that system aligns with your industrial requirements, not the Elvathi's. And System 2? Voss asked. System 2 becomes a joint development zone administered by a neutral council with representatives from both species, and overseen by the Empress's own arbitration office. The mineral wealth is split according to extraction contribution. Whoever mines more, earns more. This gives both of you an incentive to invest rather than fight. And it gives the Empress a precedent for resolving future disputes of this kind. Silence. Korath looked at Voss. The Elvathi prelate's drones had settled into a low, idle hum, which was the Elvathi equivalent of deep thought. He looked at Cyrath. The Rythkari commander's scales had returned to their normal silver, and his grip on his plasma lance had loosened. Okafor had not just proposed a compromise. He had built it on a foundation of knowledge so deep and so specific that neither side could dismiss it. He knew their laws, their histories, their economies, their internal politics. He knew the names of their predecessors. He knew which minerals their species actually needed. He knew everything. Carried all of that into this room in his head, with nothing in his hands. Korath realized something that hit him like a physical blow. The other delegations spent their resources on weapons. They spent their preparation time choosing which arms to carry, which armor to wear, which display of force would make the biggest impression. They came to the assembly, ready to threaten. The humans spent all of that time and energy on something else entirely. They came ready to understand. While everyone else was polishing their weapons, the humans were reading every treaty, studying every economy, learning every cultural pressure point, memorizing every political vulnerability. Not as threats, not as leverage, just as knowledge. Because knowledge in the hands of someone willing to use it carefully was worth more than every plasma lance in the galaxy. This is acceptable as a framework for further discussion, Voss said slowly. Cyrath stared at Okafor for a long time. He nodded once. We will consider it. Okafor inclined his head and walked back to the human section. He sat down as if he had done nothing more remarkable than check the weather. Korath looked up at the Empress. Her crystal throne had changed. The black was gone, replaced by a deep warm amber. The sharp edges had softened into smooth curves. She was looking at Okafor, and as he watched, the Empress inclined her head toward the human ambassador. A tiny gesture, a fraction of a movement. Ambassador Thyla inhaled sharply beside him. "What was that?" Korath asked. "That," Phyla said, in a voice that shook slightly, "was the Empress's acknowledgement. It has not been given to any delegation in over 40 years. Korath looked at Okafor. The human ambassador was already talking quietly with his colleagues, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. His hands were still empty. But Korath no longer thought of them as empty. He was beginning to understand that. Those hands were carrying something heavier than any weapon in the room. The ceremonial dinner on the 5th night was supposed to be the most peaceful event of the entire assembly. The grand convocation hall had been transformed. Tables of living crystal grew from the floor in elegant spirals, each one calibrated to the dietary needs of whichever species sat there. The lighting was soft and warm, and the crystal walls sang a low harmonic melody that was said to be the Empress's favorite lullaby from when she was young. Even the most aggressive delegations had relaxed into something approaching comfort. Korath sat at the Dravari table and allowed himself to enjoy the food for the first time since the assembly began. The nutrient paste was excellent, infused with trace minerals from the Empress's own homeworld. He watched the room with a feeling that was close to contentment. The Rithkari and Ilzathi delegations sat closer together than they had before Okafor's intervention. Not quite friendly, but no longer hostile. Commander Cyrath had even nodded to Prelate Voss upon entering, which according to Phila was the Rithkari equivalent of a warm handshake. The humans sat at their table and ate and laughed, and looked exactly as they always did, calm and untroubled and completely unarmed. Korath had spent the last 2 days studying them whenever he could. He had noticed things that other species seemed to miss. The humans moved differently from everyone else. Not just the absence of weapons, but the way they held themselves, the way they positioned their bodies, the way their eyes moved. They were always watching, not with fear and not with suspicion, but with a quiet, steady alertness that never turned off. They looked like people who were relaxed, but Korath was beginning to suspect that humans were never truly relaxed. They were simply very good at looking that way. He had also noticed that several members of the human delegation, who he had assumed were diplomats or advisors, moved differently from the others. Slightly more spread out, always positioned between the main group and the nearest entrance. One of them was a woman with short red hair and pale skin and eyes the color of frozen water. She was introduced as Captain Marin Shaw, a cultural attaché. Korath did not believe for a moment that she was a cultural attaché. Cultural attachés did not scan every doorway they passed through. Cultural attachés did not sit with their backs to walls. Cultural attachés did not have hands that moved with the unconscious precision of someone who had trained for combat every day of their adult life. But he said nothing, because saying something about the humans felt dangerous, in a way he could not quite explain. The Empress entered the hall last, as tradition demanded. She was ancient and frail, a wisp of a being draped in robes of living light, but her presence filled the room like gravity. Every delegation rose. The crystal walls sang louder. She took her seat at the high table and raised one translucent hand, and the dinner began. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was the galaxy at its best, 42 species breaking bread together under the protection of the oldest throne in known space. And then the lights went out. Not dimmed, not flickered. Off. The crystal walls went silent. The harmonic melody died mid-note. For one terrible heartbeat, the entire grand convocation hall was plunged into absolute darkness. Then the screaming started. Korath heard the crash of tables being overturned. He heard the distinctive shriek of plasma lances charging, and the buzz of drone swarms activating, and the thunderous crack of Gorvathi bone armor expanding into full combat configuration. Emergency lighting flickered on, red and harsh, and Korath saw chaos. Figures were pouring through the service entrances at the back of the hall. Dozens of them, Gorvathi, but wrong somehow. Their bone armor was painted black and modified with jagged extensions that no standard Gorvathi warrior would use. They moved with the brutal coordination of elite soldiers, and they were heading straight for the high table, straight for the Empress. "Coup faction," Phila hissed beside him. She grabbed Korath's arm and pulled him down behind their overturned table. "Rogue Gorvathi, the hegemony's internal war has finally spilled over. Stay down." The palace guard responded, but they were overwhelmed immediately. The assassins had planned this perfectly. They had knocked out the main lighting, the automated defenses, and the communication systems in a single coordinated strike. The guards fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. And then everything got worse. In the red emergency light, the armed delegations began to react, but not in coordination. The Rithkari fired their plasma lances at the assassins and missed, and hit a section of the wall near the Ilvathi. The Ilvathi drone swarms activated and could not distinguish between Gorvathi assassins and Gorvathi diplomats, and began targeting both. A stray neural whip from the Kelesh caught a Tharn warrior across the face, and the Tharn bellowed with rage and swung a cannon in the wrong direction. It was exactly what the assassins wanted. The armed delegations were turning on each other, old grudges and old fears igniting in the panic. Every weapon in the hall that was supposed to represent strength and sovereignty was now creating confusion and carnage, and the assassins were cutting through it all, heading for the Empress. Korath watched in horror from behind his table. He could see the high table, he could see the Empress, standing now with her robes of light flickering, surrounded by her personal guard, who were falling one by one against the black-armored berserkers. And then he saw the humans move. It was like watching a different species. They did not panic. They did not scramble for weapons they did not have. They did not freeze or scream or turn on each other. They moved. It was coordinated in a way that made the assassins' planning look crude by comparison. One moment the human delegation was scattered across their dinner table. The next moment, they were flowing through the chaos like a river cutting through rock. Every human moved with purpose, not away from the danger, but toward it, toward the Empress. Captain Marin Shaw was at the front, and she was no longer pretending to be a cultural attaché. She reached the first assassin before he reached the Empress. The Gorvathi berserker was 3 times her size, covered in black bone armor with bladed extensions that could cut through steel. Shaw did not have a weapon. She did not need one. She grabbed a broken piece of crystal table as she ran, a shard about the length of her forearm, and she hit the assassin in the one place his modified armor did not cover, the joint where the neck plates met the shoulder ridge. Korath had studied Gorvathi anatomy in school, but Shaw did not fight like someone who had studied it in school. She fought like someone who had memorized it the way a surgeon memorizes the body, with the kind of knowledge that goes beyond thought and lives in the hands. The assassin dropped. She was already moving to the next one. The rest of the human delegation reached the high table and formed a ring around the Empress. 28 unarmed humans, standing between the most important being in the galaxy and a squad of elite bone-armored killers. They fought with everything that was not a weapon. Tables became barricades. Crystal shards became blades. The hall's own architecture became a fortress, as humans used pillars for cover and doorways as choke points. One human, a tall woman with gray hair, who Korath had thought was an economic advisor, disabled a Gorvathi berserker by using the hall's gravity controls to triple the weight on a 3-meter section of floor while the assassin was standing on it. He collapsed under his own armor, pinned like an insect under a stone. Shaw was extraordinary. She moved through the Gorvathi assassins like she was made of smoke and razor wire. She knew exactly where to strike, exactly how much force to use, exactly which joints to target. She did not fight with rage or desperation. She fought with something far more terrifying than either. She fought with absolute calm precision, the same calm precision that the humans carried in everything they did. 11 minutes. That was how long it took. 11 minutes from the moment the lights went out to the moment the last assassin was pinned to the floor. 11 minutes of unarmed humans fighting bone-armored berserkers in the dark, in the middle of a hall full of panicking armed aliens. When the main lights came back on, and the crystal walls resumed their song, the human delegation was standing in a circle around the Empress. Every one of them was bruised or bleeding. Some were holding broken limbs. One man had a gash across his forehead so deep that Korath could see bone. None of them had moved from their positions. None of them had fallen. None of them had run. And not one of them had picked up a fallen weapon. Korath stared at that detail because it was the detail that mattered. There had been weapons everywhere. Plasma lances dropped by dead guards. Neural whips abandoned by fleeing delegates. Drone controllers scattered across the floor. Any human could have grabbed one at any time during the fight. They did not. They fought the entire battle with broken furniture in their bare hands, and they won. The Empress stood in the center of the human ring. Her robes of light burned steady and bright, and her ancient face was unreadable. She looked at the humans around her, these bleeding unarmed aliens who had thrown themselves between her and death, and she spoke. "You came with nothing," she said, her voice carrying through the silent hall, "and you gave everything." Stood at the edge of the ring. One arm pressed against his side, where Korath could see at least 2 broken ribs shifting under his skin. Blood ran down his temple and dripped onto his ruined formal jacket. But he stood straight, and his voice was steady. "We did not come with nothing, Your Radiance," he said. "We came with intent." The Empress looked at him for a long time. Then she reached out one translucent hand and placed it over his. In the entire recorded history of the Thyrvon throne, the Empress had never touched an outsider. Korath felt his mandibles trembling, and he did not try to stop them. He looked at Ambassador Thyla. She had tears running from her compound eyes, and she did not try to stop those either. The humans had never been unarmed. They had simply been carrying weapons that no one else could see. Discipline, loyalty, preparation, sacrifice. The assembly had been suspended for 6 days, while the palace guards secured the convocation hall. The rogue Gorvathi faction was hunted down and neutralized, and the delegations recovered from the chaos of that terrible night. Medical teams worked around the clock treating the wounded. The Gorvathi hegemony's legitimate government issued a formal apology so deep and thorough that it filled 17 pages of diplomatic text. The humans spent 3 days in the medical wing, and then went right back to work, as if nothing had happened. Korath learned that this was a very human thing to do. Now it was the final day, the closing ceremony of the assembly, the last time all 42 delegations would gather in the grand convocation hall before departing for their homeworlds. The hall had been repaired. The crystal walls sang again. The living crystal had regrown over the scars of battle, though if you looked closely, you could still see faint lines where the new growth met the old. Healed bones that remembered being broken. Korath stood at the entrance and adjusted his formal robes. He had not slept well. His dreams had been full of red emergency lighting and the sound of bone armor cracking, and the image of unarmed humans standing in a circle around an ancient empress while the galaxy fell apart around them. He had spent the last 6 days thinking. He had thought about the Sheldari incident, and about Ambassador Okafor standing between 2 hostile delegations with nothing in his hands, and about Captain Shaw dismantling elite assassins with a piece of broken table. He had thought about tradition and what it meant, and whether meaning could change. He had thought about what he wanted to carry into the hall today. "Are you ready?" Thyla asked beside him. "I think so," Korath said. They entered, and Korath stopped in the doorway. The Rythkari delegation was already inside. They stood in their section, in perfect formation, just as they had on the first day. But something was different. Something was missing. Their plasma lances. The Rythkari had left their weapons outside. Every single one of them stood in simple ceremonial robes of silver and white, their scaled hands empty at their sides. Commander Cyrath stood at the front of his delegation. and when he saw Korath looking, he met his eyes and nodded, once, solemnly. Korath felt something tighten in his chest. He walked further into the hall and saw the Ovathi. The soft-bodied diplomats floated on their anti-gravity platforms, but their drone swarms were gone. The buzzing, clicking clouds of tiny killing machines that had surrounded them since the first day were absent. Prelate Voss hovered alone, unprotected, and there was something in the way they held themselves that looked almost peaceful. The Kelesh had come without their neural whips. Their bare wrists looked strange and vulnerable without the coiled weapons that had always been there. Venari had left their sonic disruptors behind. The Tharn, those enormous beings who usually carried vehicle-mounted cannons on their shoulders, stood with empty hands that could have crushed boulders, but chose to hold nothing. One by one, species after species entered the Grand Convocation Hall, and Korath watched them come. The tiny Melvari, who had always worn belts of micro-grenades, came wearing simple sashes of woven light. The aquatic Drenish, who usually carried harpoon launchers modified for air use, came with only their ceremonial water cloaks. The insectoid Vrathi, whose mandibles were traditionally fitted with venom injectors, had removed them, leaving their mouths bare and unaugmented for the first time in anyone's memory. Not all of them had changed. The Gorvathi still wore their bone armor, heavier and more elaborate than ever. The shame of the coup attempt had driven them deeper into the old tradition, as if more armor could make up for the dishonor of what their rogue faction had done. A few other species clung to their weapons too, unwilling or unable to let go of what they had always known. But they were the minority now. Where once the hall had been a forest of weapons and armor and threat displays, it was now something else, something quieter. Something that felt like the first morning after a long storm, when the air smells clean and the light comes in at a new angle. Korath stood among his own delegation, and he felt the weight of his blade arms behind his back. The Dravari had not yet decided as a group what to do. Some carried their arms extended in the traditional display. Others had sheathed them in peace bindings. Ambassador Phila had left the choice to each individual. Korath had made his choice before he entered the hall. He looked across the room at the Rithkari, standing tall and bare-handed. He looked at the Ovathi, floating alone without their swarms. He looked at the Kelesh, rubbing their empty wrists as if learning what their own skin felt like for the first time. And then the humans entered. They came last, as they always did, 30 men and women in simple dark formal wear, walking in that loose natural formation that looked like water flowing around stones, calm, unhurried, completely and utterly unarmed. They looked exactly the same as they had on the first day. Nothing about them had changed, because nothing about them needed to change. Ambassador Okafor walked at the front of the delegation. He had a bandage visible under his collar, and he moved with the careful stiffness of someone whose ribs were still healing. Captain Shaw walked beside him, her red hair bright against her dark jacket, a fading bruise on her jaw, the only visible reminder of what she had done 5 nights ago. They took their seats, and Okafor looked around the hall. For a moment, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of surprise, perhaps, or recognition, or something deeper, as he saw the empty hands and bare wrists and sheathed weapons all around him. Then the Empress entered. She came from behind the great crystal doors at the back of the hall, walking instead of being carried on her throne. This was unusual. The Empress almost never walked to the assembly. She was ancient and frail, and the throne was meant to support her. But today she walked, slowly and with great dignity, her robes of living light trailing behind her like a river of stars, and she walked directly to the center of the floor. The hall went absolutely silent. The crystal walls stopped singing. Every delegation rose to their feet. The Empress stood where Okafor had stood 3 days ago, in the exact center of the Grand Convocation Hall, and she looked around at her galaxy. She looked at the weapons that were absent. She looked at the hands that were empty. She looked at the faces of 42 species who were beginning, just barely beginning, to understand something species had known all along. Then she rose in a way that had not been done in living memory. She stood taller, and her robes of light blazed brighter, and her voice filled the hall, not through amplification, but through the living crystal itself, every wall and floor and ceiling vibrating with her words. "For 10,000 years, the Empress said, you have come before me, carrying the instruments of war. You have called it tradition. You have called it respect. You have called it a declaration of your right to exist. And I have watched, and I have waited, because a truth that is forced is no truth at all." She paused, and the silence was so complete that Korath could hear his own heartbeat. "One species understood from the beginning what the rest of you are only now learning. They came to my hall with empty hands, not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to trust. Not because they had no weapons, but because they believed this place deserved better than weapons. Not because they could not fight, but because they knew that the willingness to stand unprotected before others is the highest form of courage there is." She turned slowly, her ancient eyes passing over every delegation. "At last," she said, and her voice was thick with something vast and old and patient, "you begin to understand what they have always known." The hall erupted, not in applause exactly, but in something deeper, a sound that Korath had no word for in any language, a collective exhale from 42 species that sounded like relief and grief and hope all tangled together. Korath stood among his people, and he felt tears forming in his compound eyes. He looked at the human delegation. They were not celebrating. They were not smiling with triumph or satisfaction. They looked the way they always looked, calm and steady and present. Okafor caught his eye across the hall, the same man who had nodded at him on the first day. He nodded again. Small, polite nod from one diplomat to another. But this time, Korath understood what that nod meant. It meant welcome. Korath reached behind his back. He found the ceremonial bindings that held his blade arms in their formal display position. They were old bindings, passed down through 6 generations of Dravari diplomats, and removing them was not something done lightly. He undid them slowly, one at a time, and folded his blade arms down against his body in the peace-binding position. For the first time in his diplomatic career, his arms were sheathed. His silhouette was smaller. His profile was softer. He looked less like a warrior and more like what he actually was, a young man trying to help build something worth building. Thyla watched him. She did not speak. She did not tell him he was being foolish or sentimental or naive. For the first time since Korath had known her, Ambassador Thyla smiled. It was a small smile, tired and knowing, and carrying the weight of someone who had waited a very long time to see this moment. But it was real. Korath looked around the Grand Convocation Hall one last time. He saw weapons, and he saw the absence of weapons. He saw species clinging to the old ways, and species stepping into something new. He saw a galaxy in transition, caught between what it had always been and what it might become. And at the center of it all, he saw 30 humans in dark formal clothes, with empty hands and calm eyes, who had somehow, without firing a single shot or making a single threat, changed the course of galactic civilization.